In early 13th century, there was a Catholic military order which played a pivotal role in shaping the borders of Northern Europe. The order in question is the Order of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Of course, nobody used the English name in the past. Contemporaries would have called them either Fratres Militiae Christi de Livonia, or more likely, Der Orden der Schwertbrüder. Regardless of how you choose to call them, they achieved a lot and they were extremely dedicated to the crusade. As with all orders, its story starts before it was created. There were many things that needed to happen before a military order in the Baltic would be possible. We will take a look at these things and then we'll try to find an answer to a simple question. Who made the Order of the Sword? If we go back in time to Northern Europe in early 10th century, then everybody's pagan. Skip forward 3 centuries and majority of the pagans have become Christians. Well, in reality they were as Christian as gold-plated steel is gold, but that's a different story. Scandinavians and Kievan Rus became Christian, let's say more or less willingly. Things would be different with the remaining pagans. The Prussians, Lithuanians, Latgalians, Zemgalians, Silonians, Curonians, Livonians, Estonians, Finns, and Sami people. By the way, it's possible to divide these ethnographic groups even further, but the point is, there were plenty of different pagans with their own cultures, and they weren't going to bend the knee to the Pope willingly. As all military orders, the Order of the Sword was the child of crusades. The crusade that eventually led to the conquest of the Baltic was the Livonian Crusade, and it's the one that led to the creation of the Sword Brothers. The way Livonian Crusade started was through the work of a peaceful missionary, Saint Maynard. Far from being the first to spread the love of Jesus in the Baltic. For centuries there was the occasional monk who converted a pagan here and there. But the end result of their effort was the same. Pagans remained pagan. The work of Saint Maynard seemed to follow the same trend. During his missionary work he established a church and converted a handful of pagans. Few conversions wouldn't mean much if that was the end of the story, but that was just the beginning. What missionaries before Maynard lacked was a crusading culture. In April of 1195, Maynard reasoned that in order to protect the flock of newly converted pagans, the Christendom needs to send knights to Livonia. He sent his messenger, Brother Theodoric, to the Pope to seek help. In the 10th century, any pope would condone conversion at the tip of the sword, but in the late 12th century, Europe was riding the wave of crusades. The Pope Celestine III was sympathetic to Maynard's cause and announced that anyone who would take up the cross against pagans of Livonia would get remission of sins. Creating a church with a handful of converts gave an excuse for war as old as Rome, conquest and self-defense. And so started the last crusade against pagans, the Livonian Crusade. Despite Pope's announcement in 1195, not much happened. It took 2 years for the organization of a modest crusade. A year later there was even a bigger crusade, but neither one achieved lasting results. Sure, crusaders won the battles, converted some pagans, probably felt good about themselves, but they didn't achieve anything lasting. The problem lies in the nature of crusades. If you think of crusades as these well-organized military campaigns where knights gathered together from the whole of Christendom to defeat the infidels, then you have quite the wrong image in your mind. In the 12th century there were exactly 0 centralized states with a standing military that could be organized. What you get instead is a coalition of the willing for a certain period of time. In Livonia, crusading period was from late spring to early autumn. After crusaders did their due, they just went back home. Imagine leading a conquest where your army leaves you for 6 months and you have to defend the conquered land with who's ever left. The main problem of crusades was the lack of incentives for crusaders to stay. A perfect example is what happened between the fall of 1198 and spring of 1199. After crusaders left in fall, In early spring, Livonians threatened any man of Catholic Church with death if they would stay in their lands. Surprise, surprise, all of the monks fled. How can you defend conquered lands if the only men left behind are non-combatants? Well, an institution of soldiers devoted to crusading sure sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? You'd get boots on the ground all year round. The ground was fertile for the creation of a military order. Even though the ground was fertile, somebody still needed to plant the seed. To be frank, the creation of the Sword Brothers is a little bit of a mystery. It's because we have 3 accounts of the creation of the order, and each one of them names someone else as the founder. First of all, according to a bull written in 1204 by the Pope Innocent III, the Order of the Sword was created by the 3rd Bishop of Livonia, Albert of Riga. Our second source, Man on the Ground, Henry of Livonia, states that the Order of the Sword was created by Theoderic in 1202. If that wasn't enough, then Arnold of Lübeck in 1211 described the creation of the Sword Brothers as a spontaneous creation of the willing knights. In the end, we have 3 statements giving 3 different names. To solve this mystery, we will have to go with Alice down the rabbit hole. First, let's take a look at Albert of Riga. If the Order of the Sword was the most influential institution in Livonia, then Albert was the most influential man. Born around 1165 in northern Germany, he came from a noble family and he pursued a career in the clergy, eventually becoming the 3rd Bishop of Livonia. It wasn't uncommon for bishops to rule a considerable amount of land. When in 1199 Albert was coronated as the Bishop of Livonia, he became the ruler of the newly conquered lands. His actions following his coronation show us that he was perfectly aware of the main problem standing in the way of Christianizing the Baltic, which was the lack of incentives for crusaders to stay in Livonia. In the first few years of becoming a bishop, he started ennothing knights' land in Livonia. Ennothing is a way of giving rights to a land for a person in exchange of some sort of service. In this case, the persons receiving the land would be knights, and the service would be military assistance against pagans. Having knights live in freshly Christianized lands who have self-interest in defending the land and a promise to help you sure sounds like a smart move to me. The next place of grand foresight came from Albert's prevalence to take hostages from the nobility of the pagans. After winning a battle in 1200, Albert requested 30 boys of Livonian elders as hostages to ensure the peace deal they had agreed to. To be clear, taking hostages to ensure fulfillment of an agreement was very common all throughout history up until modern times. In Livonia, the hostages tended to be children, and what he did with them was perhaps immoral, but sure as hell genius. Albert took the hostage children back to Germany. If the pagans kept their word and got their children back, they would be getting good little Christian children. With his hostage strategy, Albert ensured that the next Livonian nobility will be at least partially Christian. Children weren't the only pagans that got to see the grandeur of Christendom. Kaupo, the Livonian king, willingly took a trip with Theoderic to Germany, where he was taken on a tour. After visiting Germany, Theoderic escorted him to the Pope. Innocent III met him with open arms and questioned him about the life of the Livonian people. At the end of the meeting, Pope gifted Kaupo 100 gold pieces, which would be in total around 300 grams of gold. Additionally, the Pope gifted him a Bible handwritten by the Pope Gregory. For such gifts to be given, the Pope had to be impressed by Kaupo, and Kaupo was definitely impressed by what he had experienced. After his year-long trip, he became one of the biggest supporters of the Crusades in Livonia. There's a point here that rarely sees the light of day. There were plenty of pagans that wanted to convert to Christianity. In fact, the nobility of at least some of Latgalians was Christian before Crusaders came. To be fair, they were Orthodox Christians, but nevertheless they were Christian. It wasn't as black and white as Christians versus pagans. Albert exploited the gray zone to foster inner conflict. Given everything we have seen Albert do, would it be in his character to create a military order, which would solve the greatest problem lying ahead of conquering Livonia? Absolutely. It would be unbelievable if he wasn't involved. It's clear that Albert had the motivation and foresight to create the order, but there's a problem. A military order has members. Who talked to each of them? Who pitched them the idea of joining the order? Who talked to the Pope to get his approval? By the year 1204, Albert was a newcomer to the Livonian theater. Would he be capable of convincing knights to change their lives forever and join the order? There might be another man who's a better fit for the purpose. Henry of Livonia, the man on the ground, named Theodoric as the man who created the order. Henry's Chronicle of Livonia has been fact-checked from top to bottom. It's obvious that he is biased towards the Catholic Church, sometimes bending the truth to display it favorably. But he wasn't a liar. It would be unlike Henry to straight up invent facts. It must have seemed from his perspective that the creator of the order was Theodoric, and he might be onto something. As early as 1187, Theodoric has been in Livonia, described by Henry as a messenger of the first Bishop Maynard. While fulfilling the duties of a priest, he was pretty much second in command for all of the bishops. Could he be the one who talked to the Pope and the knights? In short, yes. Theodoric visited the Pope rather frequently in order to represent the bishops of Livonia. He had plenty of opportunities to talk to the Pope. We also know that he was able to organize knights for a common cause. In fact, Theodoric was the one who in 1197 organized the First Crusade, which becomes even more impressive when you consider the fact that he couldn't do it from a position of authority. He wasn't even a bishop, he was only a priest. What he asked of knights wasn't some spare change either. He asked them to go to war to a foreign land. Additionally, knights weren't peasants, they came from the upper society. His ability to gather an army for the First Crusade speaks volumes of his ability to convince people to join a common cause. If by asking to join a crusade, you're asking a man to risk his life for a summer, then by asking him to join the Sword Brothers, you're asking a man to go on a crusade for the rest of his life. That's a bigger ask. So big in fact that I don't think a person would agree to it if he hadn't tried crusading before. It's far more likely that the knights that joined the order were crusading veterans. Chronicle of Arnold points in the same direction. When he mentions the creation of the order, he says that many men desire to fight for God alone. Arnold's statement implies that they were fighting for something other than God before, and that the ones who desired to join the order had been on crusades before. Theodoric's connection to veteran crusaders makes him the best suited to be the man who offered them to join the order. But perhaps we don't need Albert or Theodoric. What if knights did it themselves? What if the knights, wanting to fight for God alone, created the order themselves? That's what Arnold of Lubeck said in 1211. They formed themselves into a knighthood of Christ. His statement is a bit vague, but it's not as unlikely as one might imagine. The Knights Templar was famously founded by two knights. Friedrich Benninghoven states that two more orders were self-founded by knights as well, the Order of Alcantara and the Order of Santiago. Clearly, there's precedent for self-organized military orders. Was this the case in Livonia? Let's take a step back and look at the type of man who would like to join military orders in general. First of all, military orders consisted of volunteers. These volunteers were knights, and they were the cream of the society. Not the thickest cream, but thick enough to have a small to medium-sized estate, of which they were in charge of. By joining the Sword Brothers, they would have to become warrior monks. The monk part should be underlined. The vows that the knights had to swear to were of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the Lord, which in practice meant giving up all of their property, contact with women, and becoming obedient to the master of the order. In terms of material well-being, comfort, and freedom, their lives would become significantly worse by joining the order. There had to be something that would offset the sacrifice of joining the order. If you take out worldly pleasure out of the equation, then what's left? Well, there's religion. Kings and bishops might have had secular aims, but the men joining the order did it because they were true believers. If you wanted to imagine the type of man that joined the order, then think of a CEO of a small to medium-sized company who's at the same time a soldier and who has killed people in hand-to-hand combat, and sprinkle a religious fanatic on the top of all of that. That's the kind of person Theodoric or Albert would be trying to convince to become a warrior monk. If the knights didn't want to join the order, then you could pitch it any way you wanted. Nobody would join it. It must come as no surprise that Catholic military orders had a tendency to become more and more independent as time goes on. The Order of the Sword strived for independence within the first few years of its creation. In 1207, the Sword Brothers claimed that they had the rights to 1/3 of the conquered land. If they were strictly subordinated to Albert, then he could just say, "No, I will provide a place on my land, but that's going to be my land." In the end, it came down to the Pope to temporarily resolve the conflict. Regardless of the outcome, what we can clearly see is the dynamic of the relationship between the Order and Albert. Albert didn't have the ultimate authority, and not a single source mentions Theodoric in the power dynamic. You would expect Albert or Theodoric to have much more say in the direction of the order, especially early on, if either one was the founder of it. Now that we have followed Alice for nearly 20 minutes, the question is still up in the air. Who made the Order of the Sword? Did the knights do it themselves? Given the high status of knights and the insane offer they were given, it would be impossible for an order to rise if the knights didn't want to join. Given how quickly the order began to strive for independence and the account of Arnold, I would reason that there was some level of self-organization going on. But when we're trying to figure out who made the order, it's more of a question of who came up with the idea and who was the one who organized everything that goes into creating an order. Did any one of the knights rise up to the challenge? Probably not. If there was one, then it would be very weird for nobody to mention him by name. If there was a Hugo de Paganis-like figure, then we would have heard of him. So I don't think the order was founded by the knights themselves. Then it could have been Theodoric, because Henry, or man on the ground, said so, and since Theodoric was best suited to talk to the knights, he could have been the one who initiated the creation of the order. He could have talked to the knights, and he certainly was among the few who visited the Pope. But there are problems with Theodoric. If Theodoric was the one who made the order in 1202, as Henry implies, then why wasn't he the one in 1197 when he gathered forces for the first time? Or in 1198 when he gathered forces together with Berthold? Or in 1199, 1200, and so on? For all of these years he had knights to whom he could present the offer, and the audience with the Pope, who was very receptive to anything that would help the Crusades. Additionally, if he made the order in 1202, then why does it take Henry 3 years to mention the order again? After naming Theodoric as the creator of the order in 1202, the next time he mentioned Sword Brothers is in the February of 1205. And after 1205 he mentions them every year for 20 years straight. It seems very unlikely that Henry would forget to attribute any credit to the order for 3 consecutive years. And it wasn't as if these 3 years were peaceful and nothing happened. On the contrary, there were plenty of battles where Sword Brothers could prove themselves, had they existed. In the end, I think Theodoric was the one who talked to the knights. But I don't think he did it on his own initiative. Just like he gathered an army for the First Crusade because Maynard requested it, I think somebody else asked him to talk to the knights. Somebody who understood the main problem standing in the way of Christianizing the Baltic. Somebody who already tried fixing it by different measures. Somebody who had the authority to give sword brothers a place in Livonian. Somebody who showed up recently. In 1199, Albert became the Bishop of Livonia, and according to the Pope, in 5 years the order was born. 5 years might seem like a long time, and you could make the same critique of Albert as I did of Theodoric. Why didn't Albert make it right away? Well, there's the independence issue. Military orders had a tendency to become independent, and it's easy to see why Albert wouldn't want to deal with a strong, independent military power in his backyard. Well, wouldn't it be great if he could do without them? Wouldn't it be better to try everything else first? To try enough in Knights Land that would make those knights loyal to Albert? Or if he could perhaps convince some pagans to join his side, like he did with Kaupo? Or get more assistance from kings than his predecessors? He might have conquered the Baltic without a military order if those plans went well. Unfortunately for Albert, they weren't enough. Do you want to conquer the Baltic with the help of a military order which might become independent? Or not conquer the Baltic at all? That might have been the question Albert asked himself. If he made up his mind to make the order, it would make sense for him to send Theodoric to talk to the knights and the Pope. Henry, writing his chronicle quarter of a century later, might have remembered Theodoric as the founder, since he was the one giving the offer to the knights. Once the news of a new order came out, it might have attracted enthusiastic crusaders to join on their own initiative, leaving Arnold with an impression of self-organization. While all along, Albert was pulling the strings in the background. So that's my answer. The Order of the Sword was created by Albert in 1204 with the help of Theodoric, with a Pope Innocent III, who was a strong supporter of crusades, and it was all possible because of the underlying crusading spirit that existed in the hearts of men.